Welcome, everyone, to the Umana Yana Podcast. My name is Josh, and I'm your host. I want to invite you to join us for a conversation today that is something that I think is incredibly relevant to a lot of us, whether from personal experience or perhaps we've actually witnessed it among some folks that we love. And that would be the impact of the emotionally absent father, especially on his daughters as they grow and mature into young women and go out into the world and start to explore that for themselves. So, my guest today is a very special one. I'm very passionate about this topic, and I'm so glad that you've decided to join us. I'm going to flip it on over to you to introduce yourself to our audience today.
Hi, my name is Netu. I'm Guyanese-born, currently living in Toronto, and I'm an advocate for mental health. So I'm very excited about today's topic, and I'm very grateful to share with you as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, Neetu. And the emotionally absent father, I think that for our community, whether a father is present is one thing. And then if he happens to actually be present and emotionally present at the same time, that's almost like you hit the jackpot, right? So I think we're talking about something that maybe a lot of us hope or wish that we had maybe present within our lives, but maybe is something more that we're working towards as a way to break the cycle and maybe embody more of this as we look forward. So, I know that sometimes when we speak about these topics as, maybe first generation who have maybe been born in Canada or somewhere outside of Guyana, we have this interesting privilege, it's often referred to actually sit back and think about our emotions and, the things and how they're making us feel. So when we have the opportunity to have a conversation like this, I feel we almost have a responsibility, if you will, to everyone who's
Indeed.
listening and to the future generations to really explore this and to explore it vulnerably. So, I bring that with me today. I have my own wounds around this, and I hope that we can just really facilitate conversation that's really about empowerment and education, you know, um, and looking ahead versus just maybe focusing on the past and what has been done and sort of just locking it in there. Sound good to you? All right.
Yeah, this topic is one that, I really resonate with, and I know that it's going to hit the spot for a lot of, especially Caribbean teenagers and even adults themselves.
Absolutely. So, when we talk about, fathers, right, that's often a very sensitive topic for anyone, regardless of the culture that they come from, right? But, then we talk about presence and what presence means. So maybe as a way to lead into our conversation, when we're talking about, a father being present in this conversation, what does that mean to you, Neetu?
For me, it means like, aside from the basic responsibilities and what they provide, it means like being in tune with how they feel as well as how their family feels. It also means like being there emotionally. Like, how are you feeling? How is your day? It's these simple questions,
Yeah,
but also it makes them feel like they're somewhat connected to,
right.
more
So
than
it's like they're
just
taking a bit
our
of an interest.
blood.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I got you. And I find that sometimes when we get into this conversation, like say when even I've had conversations with my dad around certain things, he's like, "Well, I'm there." Like I'm there, right? And then you end up in a conversation, well, like I want you to feel interested in what I'm doing and ask me a couple questions, right? Like I know you're there if I need something and I come and ask you, but
Yeah.
it makes a difference when I feel like you're interested in what I'm doing too. And I think that
Indeed.
that's a big part of what I think is going to come through in our conversation today. It's maybe vocalizing a little bit more of how this can look and what will be a little bit more satisfying in these relationships.
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. So, when we think about fatherhood in the Indo-Caribbean setting and household, right? Why don't we paint the picture for, what you've just seen as a general experience of our community, right? That way, for the audiences who are tuning in and who might be parts of different cultures, just so they understand exactly, they can jump in with us as we're talking about this and they can start to relate a little bit. So, what did that look like for us in a Caribbean setting? And, what do you feel we often learn from witnessing this absence?
So growing up in Guyana, for me, not only my household, but like our families, I would see this with my uncles as well. And, like other family members and friends in the community, they would relate to this too. the fathers, they would provide, they'd be so busy with work and just, the hustle. For them, that's how they show they care. And I think that emotional absence, from that, we learn that, it's not safe, I guess, to express how you feel. It's not normal because what's considered normal for us is seeing our fathers just going out, working, providing. That's it. We don't sit and like have a casual conversation with them or express like how our day was, how we feel. It's not considered normal for us.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
hear that. And I that personally wasn't an experience that I grew up with, when it came to the father figures that I've had in my life. Like I have seen them, work tremendously hard and whatnot, but
Mhm.
I find that they almost learned and I think I might make a very unique kind of case. I think they almost learned from their own having been on the receiving end of that kind of love and experience from their own fathers, that they tried to show
Yes.
up in a bit of a different way, like, hey, let's go check out a basketball game. Hey, let's go play some pool or something. Let's go get some food together. I do find that some of them have learned, right? And they've almost seen like, hey, let me embody a little bit about what maybe I was missing, when I was growing up and maybe didn't have my father around. And so I think that that's why, our generation has a very unique opportunity to have these more open conversations than ever, because I think like, the folks who have been parents to us, they themselves are experiencing, oh, what is it that I also wanted? And what is it that I feel that I've been missing? Right. So I think we're in a very unique spot to be able to facilitate, a conversation where both sides can really learn a whole bunch from each other.
And that's so true. It's like, they're using what they've been taught as well and what they have seen as normal.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I'm curious for you, have you had, father figures in your own life, whether those are uncles or actual father, have they actually, been vulnerable enough to sort of express that they kind of missed that experience from their own fathers when they were growing up? And so that sort of impacted how they themselves show up.
So, one experience I've recently had actually was a talk with my uncle, and he knows that I also want to be emotionally present and connected to my dad. So, he was trying to explain to me that, he's had a rough childhood and he's never like experienced this fatherly love. So, maybe that's why, he's emotionally absent. So,
Right.
I was like thinking about it, and in my head, it's like, like if you didn't experience something and like you sit by yourself and you think, oh, I didn't have this growing up, and I want to give my kids this so that they can feel this love. Because that was the scenario in my head. But like at the moment, I did not know how to communicate this to my uncle because we don't usually have like these talks, it's pretty weird
Yeah.
for us. Yeah. So at the time in my head, I was like, like he watches movies and it society is so evolved. Like to me, I would think that, he has somewhat of an understanding that, I can talk to my daughter or, just have simple conversations with her. So when I told my uncle this, he was like, maybe he's just shy,
Mm.
right? And then in my head now, I'm thinking, how can you be shy to like, say something so simple, but then you're like brave when it's time to argue? And, I would say in like not all, but in quite a few Caribbean homes, it's been normalized for the dads to just show anger, but not love, which
Right.
I think is something our generation has to challenge. Yeah. So I was saying, maybe it's not that he's shy, but he just doesn't want to feel that sense of being uncomfortable.
Yeah,
I
I get
think
that.
once they can face that, it's going to be a breakthrough.
Yeah. And I don't know if this is something that you've also seen for yourself, but just like you said, like oftentimes like we're pretty comfortable. It like we don't have to think twice when we're maybe expressing frustration and anger. But when it comes to the other things, we really get in our head about it, and we almost like,
Yeah.
just clam up when it comes to that. And for me, what I've kind of witnessed, having worked with a lot of men from different ages and backgrounds and stuff, is I kind of noticed that there's this maybe lack of proactiveness when it comes to expanding our vocabulary. So, we are pretty programmed to express, sadness and rage, and that's pretty much it, right? But beyond that, to say, I am feeling confused today, I'm feeling like I don't know what to do or how to help
Mhm.
myself, things like that. Those aren't things that we necessarily have practiced or made an effort to practice saying, right? And I find that, sometimes this absent father, this situation kind of compounds that because we're not too sure. We don't have a role model that we can then, try and experiment with and see like what's okay, what's not. How do I need to tweak how I maybe express that in order to get, a supportive kind of response, right? And I find that that often plays into things. And so, how has that shown up for you? Have you noticed that as well? Like vocabulary being, pretty crucial to us actually evolving with this?
For myself, I found a lot of moments where I was unable to express how I'm feeling. And I started to think, if I'm struggling with this, I guess that's how my dad feels sometimes too. Because, like, sometimes I would get really sad and stuff and confused from like a hard day. And then, like, my friends would ask me, what's wrong? And then I'm there, like, I don't know how to tell you what's wrong. Like, I'm feeling a bit confused how to express how I feel.
Right.
So it's like a generational thing, I guess, because we weren't taught like how to safely express certain things. So it's hard for us, and I started to think back about my own parents, and they themselves probably have moments like these too.
Right. So, I noticed that as well, like within my own family. And, we're very much a mixed family. We have a lot of folks from different backgrounds and stuff who are together. And I noticed that as well. Like there's almost this discomfort when it comes to those topics where we could really like get to know each other a little bit more deeply, right? Like, something that I often laugh about with other members of the Indo-Caribbean community and Caribbean community is kind of like, even when we're having a meal together, sitting down at the table, the topic that's often most comfortable to talk about is still food. you know
Yeah.
and so, I find like we often lock ourselves out of certain topics and spaces because maybe we just don't know what'll come of it. But at the same time, the language just might not be there. Like we might actually be the first within our own lineage to be considering, hey, how are we communicating and is that effective, right? Because we're not so much necessarily just locked into a survival mindset. We're a little bit beyond that at this point, right? So it's still survive and whatnot, but we're also factoring in how do we thrive too, right? So,
Yes.
I think that positions us in a very unique way. And one way that I've personally tried to invite my family into having maybe a bit more of that language around feelings and stuff is we would have like those question cards. Like there's so many different decks of question cards around different themes and
Well,
stuff like
that's
that.
pretty cool.
Yeah, and we would bring that to like a family gathering, right? We know we'd all be sitting around at some point. So it's like, hey, let's break out the cards and let's get to know each other because these are random questions. Everyone's going to respond in their own way.
I think
And
I'm gonna
so,
steal that from you.
yeah, go for it. It's such an interesting experience because like I got to see like all ranges of the spectrum of reactions and willingness and even the body language. You could pick up on the body language, like when they're reading, it's like, oh, I've never shared this out loud, or can my family know this about me, right? So I think it invites such interesting conversation that goes beyond just when you're like looking at those questions and actually responding. It like invites further conversation later on.
It does.
Yeah. How have you found, like, have you done certain things that you feel have helped your family to maybe move further ahead when it comes to expressing themselves and, communicating maybe a bit more openly and vulnerably with one another around maybe feelings, what they want, even the good things too, right? It doesn't have to just be all the bad stuff, like even communicating the good things.
So most of my life I've been like afraid to like express myself and like ask certain questions. So at most family gatherings you'd find me be the one that's just like quiet into myself.
Yeah.
But after moving here like a year ago, um I would say the last gathering we had, I I did an activity where I asked them to write down one thing they're grateful for and share it. They
Love it.
wrote it down, but they didn't want to share it.
Okay.
So I ended up reading it for them.
I love
Yeah,
that.
and that was like probably the first time I ever tried to do something different out of
Yeah.
my comfort zone.
Yeah. And was that like was that fulfilling for you? Like after you did that little,
It
activity with
felt
them, like
pretty
how did
good
you feel
because
after?
I know it's like something I would be like scared to do or to like, have something new.
Yeah, I see. I get that. Yeah, it's so interesting, right? Because I think as well, for when we're approaching dads, especially when it comes to talking more about those feelings and those emotions, right? I've been on the receiving end of this. Sometimes it's kind of like, why are you so soft? Like, why do you need all of those things, right? And what I started to realize is that as much as the different responses that a dad might return to us when we're asking for something, and, especially from an emotional intelligence perspective, oftentimes what I find he's actually doing is giving us clues about how he was responded to in moments when he wanted
Mhm.
those very same things. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. And have you pointed that out to maybe the men who you've had these conversations with? Because I've gotten a bit more bold to try and do that.
I'm getting there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's so interesting because it helps them along in their healing as well. And I think that oftentimes when we talk about just life in general, right? We talk about how we are, what's it called? Once a man, twice a child. I think that's the phrase or something like that, right? So
Yeah.
it's almost like we do this return to, that smaller version of ourselves as we get older, right? And I think we start to actually see what wounds and things lie within us. And then therefore it points to what things we can actually work on. So, holding this space for our parents, I find it gets interesting as we get older. There becomes a point where we almost elevate and can be in this teacher position, if you will, or supporting them
Yes.
in what they're going through. So I found that to be really powerful, especially with my dad. He's never been one who hides the emotions or anything like that. And, I think he's been very, very front and center to me being able to express those things. Right. But I think that's very unique. And, even there's sometimes that resistance to me. And I think I'm giving him the same response he would offer. Right. So we have these moments where we can actually like almost like hold our father and be like, it's all right, right? Because like he might not be able to receive that hug from his elders anymore. They might not be here anymore, and that's what he most needs to most also
That's
feel
true.
like you matter. And I've noticed that.
Yeah.
I've noticed a softening happens when we point that out. Have you noticed that?
Well, I've never had like a conversation about it with any like male in my life.
Yeah.
So I would say this is the point where like I realized that yes, I need to have these conversations more often.
Right. Yeah. No, it's wonderful. And I think the more that we start to feel comfortable with the topics that we bring to the dinner table or wherever we happen to be, right? Like that's where the real healing and I feel like elevation and propelling forward of our lineage and what becomes possible is, right? Because I think we all feel a lot of these things. And I almost feel now like, like yourself, I used to be very quiet too. In those family settings, like, all right, well, I guess my presence is just enough. Like, I don't know what to say here,
Mhm.
right? But now I almost feel like if I'm clamming up and I have that fire within me to actually say it out loud and, communicate some of these things, it's like I'm almost doing my family a disservice to not show up and, kind of try and grab the torch and take it forward. You know what I mean? So I appreciate that you're doing this so much within your own family and within your community. I see the work that you do and I think it's absolutely tremendous. So, you know, I want to ask you, when we're going through it as children, oftentimes we might not necessarily understand fully what's happening, right? It's just like, well, how do we know life to be different, right? So when we get older, we start to understand how some of these things actually were because we get to contrast that with other people who have maybe lived their lives, right? So from your
Yes.
perspective, how do you see, this emotional absence and the impact of it showing up later on in life? Like, as children become adults and we start to develop new relationships, whether those are romantic or working relationships, how do you see that impacting things?
It actually varies in a lot of ways. For like daughters, I would say, they grow up to somewhat overachieve, try to be overproductive, hoping that, they would get their father's attention.
Right.
And I also think as daughters, we have this void. Like there's a saying that your father is your first love.
Right.
And I've also seen some women say that their father's also their first heartbreak. And
Yeah.
that would be because, they weren't emotionally there for them.
Yeah.
And as they grow, as these women grow, they tend to like seek their father's love in, romantic relationships. Sometimes they get into relationships that feel normal, where men are emotionally absent, but they're there because it feels normal to them. In other cases, they might end up in toxic relationships and they choose to stay because it's like they crave the love that they're willing to accept breadcrumbs. They're willing to accept the bare minimum, even if it comes with, I guess, abuse or like even if they're breaking down inside, they still stay because that's what they've seen. They've seen their mother stay, no matter how hard it was, right? She probably put up with everything, so they try to do that too. In other cases, I guess the daughters, they carry this anger within them. So they kind of like have outbursts, they get frustrated really easily, they have short tempers. And yeah, it just really varies.
Yeah.
Even with the sons as well, I find that some sons may grow up to like have multiple relationships because I don't know, they're not looking deep within themselves and like working on the inner self.
Yeah.
And I think that's because they haven't grown up seeing that. In other cases, they may actually do the opposite because they realize that, hey, my dad wasn't emotionally present with my mom and myself, so I'm going to try to do different and be better.
Yeah. I hear
Yeah.
that. I'm super curious. There's so many things that I'm curious about, right? But have you noticed there being a key difference, whether it is in the mindset or age or anything like that? When you have that differentiation between, say, the children who will maybe look at that experience and be like, okay, I need different. Like different is what I deserve and whatnot, right? Versus maybe the folks who kind of just fall back into the patterns of almost looking for that same experience of love over and over again. Have you noticed that there's a crucial difference in the experience that, and I come from this from a place of like empowerment, like maybe if there's a certain way we could intervene at a certain point, it might actually produce maybe more impactful outcomes and things like that.
From my personal experience, it's kind of like at a younger age, like when I started getting into relationships, I did fall into toxic relationships and I did stay even when I should have left, even when I was urged to leave, I stayed.
Right.
But then eventually, as time passed, I grew and I realized certain things. I'm like, no, I don't want this. I want different. So in some cases, it could be a process. Like maybe, maybe they overwork at first
Yeah.
and they start to have these realizations that I'm trying so hard just to prove myself. But when they start looking to their inner self, they realize that I am enough the way I am and I don't need to overwork. I just need to look on the inside and not try to like prove something on the outside just to get love.
Right. Yeah, no, that's super important, and I think that on adding to those as well, just to share from what I've personally experienced too, it's I think we can't deny that having access to resources can make a difference in this scenario too, right? Like, not
Yes.
everyone needs to necessarily go to a therapist per se, but having spaces where you can go and feel safe and comfortable to actually, you know, share what's actually going on within you and receive some of that love and that help or guidance, whatever it is that you need in that moment. I think that, that's often missing from the Indo-Caribbean family setting, right? Whether we have, hesitations around pursuing help and things like that, right? I think that if we actually do have these spaces, whether that's a friend or an actual professional setting, right? I think that
Mm.
that also goes a long way in us helping to understand some of these feelings. So it doesn't just sort of get, become this sort of loop that we stay stuck in, mentally and physically and energetically for, decades at a time, right? We can actually get to the idea of like us being enough and understanding that these things aren't necessarily our fault and whatnot, right? I find that sometimes we really dig into some of these things and we're driven by a lot of this anger and whatnot because we want to understand the situation so much that we almost just, you know what, I can only understand, at least I can understand it if I just accept all the blame for it, so it's my fault. You know what I
You
mean?
know, along with what you've said and having these safe spaces, um, there are some cases where like an individual tries to express how they feel, probably to an elder, but because the elder is like stuck in this past mindset, they're like, "You're sounding ungrateful. You know, you should be grateful. Why are you complaining or trying to like pin the blame?"
Yeah.
But I don't think they recognize that it's not that we're trying to blame. It's like we're trying to be heard and try to like bring change, have change in place.
I love that. That's so so important, and you make such a great point, right? Like the importance of the elder, right, and also our ability to actually have a dialogue with an elder, right, versus just have it be like
Yes.
one-way communication. So Nita, I'm curious for you. What is like, how have you maintained a relationship with the elders in your own family or circle and life, right? And how do you or how have you found success in having it open to the point where you can actually have an exchange of ideas versus just be like them just sort of inputting their thoughts and that kind of being it. You know what I mean?
I'm gonna be absolutely honest with you.
Yeah.
When I did have these conversations, I kind of just let it slide. I just, when they told me their input, I just stayed quiet. And, I started to think that, it's like this anger within you. You want to say more. That's not it. That's not the end. There is a barrier there we need to break. And so I'm still learning and I'm still, letting myself break those barriers day by day.
Yeah. Well, good on you to, to continue to show up to try and do that. I know it's not an easy thing. And, just to share an example from my own life around, some learning around the elder approach that happened for me with my paternal grandma, right? Like, so for example, I went to York University and I got a few degrees there and stuff like that. And, she was proud at the end of it, but then she, at the end of it, it's like, well, what are you studying next? Right. And, I would just sort of clam up in that moment. I'm like, what I want to say is, I've gotten all this education. I don't need more, da da da. But like, I didn't want to upset my elders. So in those moments, I wouldn't communicate that. But then, for example, leaving Canada and choosing to live abroad, right? That was a very interesting conversation with the elders because they're wondering, well, when are you coming back? Like we worked so hard to get here. Why would you want to
Yeah.
leave? And what I started to understand is that sometimes, not all the time, right? They're all going to take their own unique approaches. But sometimes when they're pushing back on our decision or our choice or whatever it is, I've actually realized that instead of taking that super personally and just being like, why don't you understand me? Why do you hate me? Da da da. I actually be like, oh, you know what? You're actually just testing me before the world tests me about how clear I am and how committed I am to what I'm telling you my plan is.
I think also they try to like protect you from certain things out there instead of letting you experience it yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
They do try to like, they have the best in mind for us,
Yeah,
but also at the same time, it's also like that fear they have within themselves for us as well. They try to
yeah,
project that too.
100%. Yeah, I totally see that. And so in us talking about, how sons and daughters, the impact that the emotionally absent father has on them, right? As they grow at different phases of life. You know, the idea often comes through that, men continue to buy into this thing that part of their role in no matter what hat they're wearing is that they need to be the strong, silent type, right? I see it no matter where on earth I am, right? It's still quite often, that thing that we reach for, that feeling of like, that's the archetype I need to embody, no matter what, right? So I want to ask you, being a daughter and a woman and, experiencing life for yourself, right? Who do you think this rule of, men ought to stay silent, like that's how they're most effective? Who do you think that most benefits and why do you think we keep buying into it?
I think this has a lot to do with history itself. I'd say, like, for example, our Indo-Caribbean men, when they were brought to Guyana by the British, they were forced to work on the fields. And if they would try to like say how they feel or complain or like rebel, they would be punished or even worse, killed. So I feel like at the time being silent protected them because it costed them their lives. But also I feel like that continued to go on for generations, even after they were freed. It still continued. They remained silent. No matter what life threw at them, they stayed silent
Right.
because that was a form of protection back then. But I think what they fail to realize is to ask themselves, do we still need this protection? Do we still need this armor?
Mm,
Yeah.
that's a great point. And I think that maybe you and I can add some personal experience in this moment to be useful to our audience, right? When we hear this conversation around, do we still need to be this quiet and silent, right? I've noticed it within myself. Sometimes, yeah, it feels almost like I'm tapping back into like a survival mechanism that I can't exactly put my finger on, right? So yes, we could say that now that we're here, 2026, life is different than perhaps the conditions they grew up in that primed them mentally to operate in that way, right? But then, how do we communicate this message and help people to understand where the balance is? Because they might be looking at, say, the world events at this moment, right? And thinking, oh, well, if I use my voice the way I truly wanted to, look at how things play out for some people who do that, right? So isn't it just better for me to stay quiet then? Right? How would you respond to that if someone were to say, share that in response to everything we've been talking about today?
I could relate this to personal relationships because, like, let's say there's a problem or something's bothering you, and you want to express it, but then you're holding back, thinking, if I express this, we might just get into an argument. This
Right.
might just turn into more trauma than you know, than it's supposed to be. So I really feel that coming to realization that if I don't speak out about what's bothering me, how is the other person supposed to know? How are we supposed to like deal with this and make things better as a team
Right.
rather than me versus you? It's us versus the problem. And I think that's how we should look at things, not just in relationships, but in other things in life as well.
Yeah. No, I that's such a beautiful share, and I totally, totally resonate and agree with you 100%. I witnessed something that I'd never seen before in my life, and this was towards the end of last year. And as a group of us were together, and all these professionals and things like that, they have all the different letters behind their names, so they're important and all that, right? But we were talking, and it became clear that someone didn't understand the message that was being shared by another individual, right? And what I saw happen there is the individual who had spoken, and what they said is that no, 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 it's not your fault or your problem that you didn't understand what I was saying. It's actually my responsibility to make sure you understand what I'm saying. So let me try that again. Right. And I think like some of that energy is definitely going to make a huge difference when it comes to
And,
our relationships and everyone feeling safe enough to actually communicate what they're feeling and what they need. Yeah.
and we can implement this as well with our fathers because let's say we try to bring up like a conversation where you're like, Dad, growing up, I really miss your emotional presence. And I really miss doing things with you. Like, I want to do things with you. I want to have this father daughter connection. We can go out have conversations, have tough conversations. And maybe in the dad's head, he might think, wasn't I good enough? Like, I
Mm.
tried, I worked so hard to provide for you, and it's sounding like I'm not enough. Maybe they think they need to be perfect in a way, but that's where the line comes. You don't need to be perfect to be enough.
Yeah.
What we're trying to convey is that I just need you to show a little effort. I know it's uncomfortable to do things that are new, things that are different.
Mm.
There's this fear within you, but all I need is for you to face that fear and make the smallest effort. It doesn't mean that, you have to be perfect. It doesn't mean I'm ungrateful for what you did. It just means, I want to be with you closer.
Right. Yeah. And when I find that this is communicated amongst everyone who has a bit of this healing that they're doing, right? What I often find is that it almost ties back into the conversations around like the love languages, right? And I start to share is like I start to think, okay, well, if I'm a father and I'm trying to show love in the way that I want to receive love, but it's not necessarily the way that my daughter or son is going to receive it because their style is different, then there's some type of tweak that needs to happen there, right? And what I find often happens is, how you mentioned, father maybe thinking, well, am I not enough like the way I am and how I've provided for you? I often find that sometimes when that conversation happens, it's a sense of dread that emerges within him because it's like, oh my God, I can't get this time back. And I could have done things differently and done it in a way that would have made a deeper impact for my child. So instead of, I know this is not necessarily a privileged reality that all people can pull themselves out of, right? But to say, oh, I had the choice to work less but I still didn't, right? My children are saying not saying I want more toys, they're saying I want more of my time, right? And when we understand kind of like, what it is that this next generation is really looking for and what they're hoping for that'll actually help them feel that fulfillment and that goodness within them. I think that's how we're going to have even more fulfilling relationships because we understand how to love each other, right? We understand that yes, you're working hard and you're doing all these things and we appreciate all of that. But the thing that's going to really help me to feel loved right now is if you spend 10 minutes with me to read that story with me or something like that. You know what I mean? And I find like that's where we are now, where we're able to actually express gratitude for all of the things and the way they have been, but also now start to infuse a little bit of, this would also make a difference to me. Yeah. That's what I noticed. Um, so what I want to know from you, Neetu, is as a woman, right? How do you feel that emotionally absent fathers shape their daughters like later in life? And I know we've talked a bit about, what they set themselves up for in relationships and things like that, right? But, I really want to know from you, how does this maybe um improperly or inadequately prepare them for, making these big life choices, especially around what they should tolerate and not tolerate in any type of environment?
I think that really that sets them up for like probably overworking, as I mentioned before, like trying to overachieve to prove themselves as worthy. And because their fathers were emotionally absent, they, as a child, you may want to like blame yourself and think, like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I get my father's love? Or why can't I get him to tell me he's proud of me? Right? That's in your head as a child. And as you start to grow, you may try to like overwork, overachieve, to try to do things to get him to say, I'm proud of you, or I love you,
Right.
or you are enough. So you grow up thinking you're not enough. So you try to do all these different things to just feel enough. But then you realize, I'm working so hard, but I feel burnt out. And you ask yourself, why? And that's when you need to realize it's not about doing more on the outside. It's about looking inwards and realizing it's not that I'm not doing enough. It's that I don't feel enough because I'm trying to get something that's locking from the inside. It's that void. where your father's love is, and you're
Mm.
trying so hard to get it. So I'd say it really like affects their self-esteem. A lot of them would have low self-esteem. Some of them hold back on their own dreams because they don't feel they're worthy enough to achieve them.
Right.
So if they had like their father's emotional presence, it would be different. They would have more belief in themselves, higher self-esteem. They
Mm.
would also know what to, they would also have higher standards in relationships, I should say.
Yeah. I hear that. And, I think back to like when I was dating, right? And, that was happening in Toronto and whatnot. And, um, without even getting into conversations around, family structure and things like that, like for me, I noticed that I could really pick up on these cues around, say, women who hadn't necessarily had the chance to heal from that father wound and the emotionally absent father, right? I would notice this almost not subservience, right? But it's like they were never confident that they had done enough, right? And it was this constant sort of check-in around validation. And like I also saw them, to be very honest with you, engage with some really harmful behavior for the mere hope that they could feel something, even if that something was deep pain or things like that. You know what I mean? And that's what I definitely
Yes.
noticed. And I thought to myself, wow, like I'm not sure if everyone is if this individual has tapped into this maybe being some of the fallout of an emotionally absent father. And I'm not too sure where they're at in, how they're going to heal from that. But I think that the cues are definitely there. And I think that it's not just, limited to, women that I was dating, like even amongst friends, you could definitely see there's a big difference when that father is not emotionally there, or physically there, right? There's definitely, voids that we might not have the vocabulary for that just kind of turn into this anger and state of confusion that has us not
Yes,
necessarily
yes.
looking forward, like having like say a 5 year or 10 year plan or goal for our life. It's more just like a living day to day get by. Like that's kind of some of the generalizations, if you will, that I personally noticed when I've known that there's been an emotionally or physically absent father.
And also for the sons, I'd say just as the daughters, do things to feel something, just to feel something, this can also be related to the sons as well, where you find like maybe in some cases they turn to like alcohol, drugs. They do it just to feel something or just to let the pain somewhat disappear.
Yeah.
Where in actuality, they're just craving their father's love.
Yeah. 100%. And I think something really interesting that we can explore here, right, is oftentimes, yes, I'm all for the alchemy of, pain into something, and we really look at our experience and make sure that none of it was for nothing, right? I totally get all of that. But sometimes I think we might mislabel or have a bit of misguidance around some of those things, right? And where I'm coming from that is, what are some like behaviors that you've seen amongst adult daughters, and we could even talk about sons if you like, around, the things that they might normalize if they don't have that emotional or physical presence of a father, right? Things that they might normalize that are actually not rooted in empowerment. It's more them making the best of the situation. And I get that they might be two sides of the same coin, but sometimes when we just say, oh, that person made the most of their situation, they wouldn't be how they are today had that not happened. That can be true, but we need to understand at the same time, like the messiness of all of that. You know what I mean? Like, do you get where I'm going with that?
I do, I do. For that, I'd say, like, as a daughter, and when you try to overwork, it really builds up in your head. And sometimes you tend to stay silent about a lot of these topics. And what you find is that it breaks you down on the inside. It's like a
Mm.
bunch of threads in your head, like, it's really messy up there. And when you try to like reach out to resources or like have these resources to deal with it, and you come to certain realizations, it's like, yes, I understand this, but how do I clear up the mess in my head? How do I do that?
Yeah. Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, I mean, like what I find, happening in a way is like our generation has kind of said, you know what, we're not necessarily just going to say that, yeah, getting the job and the house and having the kids and getting married, that's good enough for us, right? Like what I find has happened in a lot of places, across communities, is everyone's kind of pumped the brakes on like all of those life plans that might be things that they don't necessarily want, and they're just like, hang on, let me check in with where I'm actually at right now. Do I want to become a parent? Am I equipped to become a parent? Am I willing to risk that the cycle that I experienced at the hands of my father repeat with the father of my children? Right? I find a lot of that is happening, and I think we also, can't be remiss in understanding how, a general widespread infertility, movement, not only limited to women but amongst men as well. Right? Like we have some of these things happening, and yes, there are a whole ton of things that we can point to. But I also think that we need to include that emotional baggage that we are carrying from all of these experiences that we haven't necessarily processed, and this fear, right? Around like, you know what? I don't even want to trust myself with someone, say romantically, because that might result in us having a child. And then will that be just a repeat of history? Right? I think that's often lost. And I think that that's a very needed part of the conversation, as uncomfortable as it might be, because we might actually be talking to some elders who that kind of played out for them. Right. But I think it's so, so necessary.
It is very much necessary.
Yeah. So, for the women who are listening to what we've been sharing today, right? And they're like, wow, this is hitting really close to home. I totally resonate with what is being shared here. What would you say, whether from personal experience or what you've observed or studied, what are some practical first steps that someone can start to take when it comes to healing some of these wounds, right? And, I think that we all have unlimited resources now, whether it's your chat GPTs, your Googles, whatever, that we can all just go and we can plug in a question and get some typed out response, right? But I think we're all really longing for real people to communicate. So, I want to hear from you. How do we do this from a place of understanding, not just from intellectually having it stored somewhere in our mind?
I'd say it goes a lot to like connecting to your inner child. And as hard as it can be to like rethink these scenarios of how your childhood was, as hard as it was and as uncomfortable as it is, facing it really means like cry if you have to cry. You cry, you let it out, but you ask yourself, what was my inner child missing? What was my inner child craving? And you do things to make your inner child happy. And for me, this looked a lot like writing poetry. So I would write a lot about how my childhood was, how I felt having an emotionally absent father. And I once shared it, hoping that, others could connect and know that they're not alone in it. But also, while some did connect and some did reach out to me and say, I can so relate to this, on the other hand, there was a family member who opposed this because it's like, to them, it sounds like I'm being ungrateful or like I'm targeting my dad. But to me, that's not the case. So I know that as women or as children, teenagers even, sometimes we want to face these things and break the barriers and have the tough conversations. But there are also the opposing side to the story. They're like the elders, as we mentioned before, that are gonna try to have a different point of view. They're gonna say, like, oh, you're being ungrateful.
Yeah.
But you know to yourself, like, you're not. So dealing with that, it's really reminding yourself of what your grounds are, what your intentions are, and knowing that it's not you trying to project blame or it's not you being ungrateful, it's you trying to make a change. And sometimes when you're breaking barriers, when you're making a difference, you're not always gonna have support. It
Mhm.
can seem lonely, but it's remembering your why that truly counts. and knowing that even while you're doing it, your voice may shake. You may not know what to say at the moment. It's going to look messy, but it's all about you just trying and continue trying, even though the first time you may fail, it may seem hard, but it's all about remembering your why.
Yeah, no, that's great insight, and I appreciate that. Thank you for that. And we do keep circling back to, I guess, understanding how we can respectfully address our elders, but at the same time push things forward, right? As much as they've maybe felt that they're the heads of the family, the leaders of it, right? We're very much at this transitionary stage where I think we're all figuring out, where do I feel the confidence to now grab the torch and carry that forward for our lineage, right? And so something that I think would be really useful, Neetu, is to do this exercise with you, where it's like, I think we've both been on the receiving ends of elders saying, you're coming across as ungrateful, right? So, if I'll share from one that I've used, for example, or something that's helped me when responding to that. And if you wouldn't mind sharing maybe how you've responded to that in the past, just for others who are looking maybe for inspiration or a bit of a real life template of something that they can use. Like for example, for me, I let them know, like, I'm so grateful for everything that you've done for us, right? And I'll actually point out a few of those things so they feel seen, right?
Mm.
So, the journey to get here, supporting all of us, making sure that we're all good before you even look at yourself, for example, right? And I find that one word that often throws off this conversation is but, right? So when we say, yeah, I love what you did there, but you didn't show up for me, you didn't da, 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 like that's usually where it goes off the rail, because that's where it sounds like, oh, well, what about all the things I did do? So I've found it to be really useful when having these conversations where I'm trying to build on what someone else has done, when I use the word and instead of but. I find that it keeps space like for what they've done, and it also creates space for, like, say, what we're trying to do, right? So if I point that out and I say, like, I'm so grateful you guys did this, this, and this. And now because you've done that, that's laid the foundation for me to look at our family and be like, what do I want to improve in my lifetime? And what that looks like is I want to be a bit more present and work a little less and, spend more time with you guys and, all the things. And then that way they're not looking at it like I'm condemning their existence and their life choices. I'm acknowledging them, but I'm holding space for the fact that I want something different. Not that I want something better, but I want something different. How do you think you as an elder might receive that?
That actually sounds much better than hearing the word but, and it's actually something I personally am gonna steal from you.
Go for it. Yeah. Have you
But
found any
it's a
success,
good
like, for
concept.
yourself on your side, like when you've tried to deal with elders? Like, I know it's an emerging thing for you, but have you noticed some things that do make a difference when you are trying to position those conversations so far?
So far, it would be like reminding them what I'm grateful for and like some happy moments as well. Like saying, when I was little, I really enjoyed like when I would go out with my dad or take when he took me on afternoon rides.
Mhm.
I found that that makes it, a bit more light because I'm reminding them of these beautiful moments that we also shared.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's so great. And I think a common thread that really runs through everything we've spoken about too is like our dedication and commitment to being grateful for everything that's happened, but also to break some of these cycles that we understand are kind of keeping us from continuing to progress as a people, as a lineage, as a family, right? So, when it comes to breaking cycles, all of us, it sounds good in theory. Yeah, why not? Why wouldn't we want to do that, right? But as I think time and history shows us, it's harder to actually put that into practice than to just talk about it, right? So, I want to know from you, what do you feel? And this can provide some guidance to, say, the men out there who are really willing to examine how we've done things and start to explore what can be different, right? So using this as inspiration, what does emotional responsibility actually ask of the Caribbean man on a day-to-day basis? What does that look like? If you were to be the one to define it and really express the whole scope of it, what does that look and feel like?
Well, first and foremost, it looks like facing what's uncomfortable. It asks them to look within themselves as men and realize what their childhood looked like versus the childhood that they're giving their children. And you kind of like compare the two and you sort of examine it and you're like, when I was a child growing up, I felt this way, and I want my children to feel what I didn't feel. I want them to have what I didn't have emotionally. So let's say maybe my father didn't hug me when I was a child. So now I have kids. I'm going to hug them, embrace them, and let them feel that love.
Right.
And in some way, that's also healing my inner child, you know?
Right.
So I think as men, it's really a lot of self awareness that comes.
Mm.
And also, communication is really a big thing. They have to communicate with their wives, their children, and, like just check in. Like, what do you need emotionally? How are you feeling? What can I do to make you feel more safe? Safe to express yourself, to tell me how you feel.
Right.
It really acts of that. Especially in romantic relationships, as a man, you need to create the space where your partner can safely express how they feel without feeling like, oh, this is going to turn into an argument or like they're just trying to blame you for something.
Yeah, I get that. So, I think that something that often complicates this process, of us all kind of getting onto the same page is all these different ideas around how a man is supposed to show up and how he actually models this strength and all the other things that we're hoping that he does, right? So, we've already spoken around the idea that it goes beyond just, money. Like providing is not just about a paycheck. It's about providing emotional safety too, right? Not just a physical roof over your head, right? So understanding the other needs that we're going about and trying to meet, right? And you make a wonderful point. I think it is very important for us to connect with the people that we are loving to understand what is it that they need and how can we show up better. And I also want to build on that and say that I think that a lot of the turmoil that maybe men feel within themselves will be alleviated if we actually ask of ourselves and answer those very same questions. Because sometimes I think like it's a very human thing. Sometimes we're almost expecting other people around us, because they've known us for a while or whatever it is, to just tap in and predict what it is we're supposed to need without us communicating it, right? And so when we can actually be like, well, hey, babe, like, what do you need tonight? Like, would you like me to make dinner? This and that. Okay, that's going to make you feel like I'm investing time in this relationship. I'm taking care of you. I care about your nutrition, all those things. Wonderful. Okay, great. We got you taken care of. But now on the flip side, what do I need in order to feel taken care of as well? Because I'm also a partner in this relationship. And sometimes because we might be locked in on this showing up in ways that we never received, right? We're also still not receiving the things that we didn't receive that are driving us forward to make these choices. You know what I mean? So I find like I've been I've been prey to that where I kind of just expected my partner or someone I was dating to understand my need without actually saying it, even though I kept rolling out the red carpet for them to communicate their needs. So we almost need to, I feel, roll the carpet out for ourselves too, to communicate and understand that it's okay to have needs, right?
That's
And
true.
to
I can
communicate them.
relate to that as well. Because at times I would expect my partner to somewhat read my mind and figure out what's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
totally.
then I realized that I also need to build my self awareness and communicate my feelings as well so that he can do his part. And as an elder daughter, because, we're not so used to receiving love, communication, and affection from our fathers, I think sometimes we kind of build these walls and it's like we don't realize it. We don't
Mm,
realize that we're blocking this receiving energy. And I think that's where we need to tap in and break those walls and be open to receiving, be open to asking for help when we need to.
That's a wonderful point. And it's almost like, and I've seen this play out as well, among men and women, where we actually don't even realize that we've almost become just like them as a survival mechanism. right? And then
Yes.
what does that do? That kind of positions us, when we speak about a romantic relationship. Now, because of say overcompensation, because we didn't get that love and affection from say one parent, now we seem a little bit more masculine or we seem a little bit more feminine, and that kind of throws off the dynamics within the relationship, right? And so I think we've all probably had some personal experience with this, right? Where we out of survival, right? That's oftentimes the place that people are coming from. Out of survival, there was a need for me to also kind of be my own dad and understand how this world works, because he wasn't there to really help me understand it. So I guess through his actions, that helped me understand it. You know what I mean? So I've seen that play out as well. And that leads to different challenges within the relationship, because you have to be on the same page to understand, okay, this is what we're dealing with. We're trying to help you heal from that. And that is something that takes a lot of time, energy, patience, and commitment from all sides, right? So I think we also have to factor that in when we think about how this is really, this is one of those efforts that really does take a village in a way.
It does.
Absolutely. So, final question that I have for you today, Neetu, is, for the parents who are raising sons right now, right? What are some things that you feel would make a difference when it comes to how we educate them, how we model different behaviors for them, how we even maybe intervene to course correct them when they're walking on a path that's not necessarily going to do them all that well, right? How do we do that and encourage them to really, feel what they're feeling deeply and to actually feel safe enough to communicate it without the shame and the poking and the making fun of, like some of us might have experienced, right? So that they don't feel like tapping into that means that they're betraying their manhood.
I think first and foremost, as parents, we need to be open with each other. Like, as a mom and dad, we need to model these behaviors. As a father, we need to know that it's okay to cry in front of our wives. And it's okay for our children to see that as well, so that they know that when they're dealing with situations, they're not alone. They have their parents, they have their siblings to comfort them, because it's a family. We're there for each other. It's not, like it's not you dealing with these situations by yourself. So, as a child seeing that, I think they would really understand that it's safe for me to go to my parents and express how I feel. It's safe for me to go to them and say, I'm not feeling too well about this. I feel I'm not quite as confident. Can you help me feel a bit more confident? And if we need reassurance as either a male or a female, and we go to our partners and we can openly ask for this, when our kids see that, I think they understand that, oh, if I'm lacking something, I feel safe to go to my parents and ask this. And eventually, as they grow too, they start to mirror these exact habits with their partners. And I think that makes a really huge difference.
Yeah. I love those. I think those are wonderful. And, I'd love to add a couple of my own as well to that. I think that you hit the nail on the head when you were talking about basically the visibility of kids and your partner seeing that you have needs, right? So for example, let me know if you can relate to this, but I would often see, a parent who they won't sit down and give themselves a moment to rest or eat their food or do something that they enjoy until like all the dishes are done, until everyone is in bed, whatever. That's the only time it's safe. And what I noticed is that, you know, I guess I was observing that without realizing it, because even now, I find that I still have a tendency of like, I'll take care of everybody in the room like all the time, right? But I almost want to take care of myself when I'm not visible, when I have no witnesses that I'm doing that. You know what I mean? And I think that a lot of us go to great lengths, especially men, to almost show that we're superhuman. And like there have been times when, for example, a dad would be asleep on the couch after work, like he's taking a nap or something, and everyone's just mad, right? Like, why is this man sleeping on the couch? Whatever. But it's like, hang on, should we not celebrate the fact that he feels safe enough to actually rest in the presence of everyone else? Right, admittedly, that was not my early feelings around it, right? Like that's more as I got older and started to understand a little bit more. But I think if we almost shift that, it almost gives everyone permission to state and communicate what it is that they want, right? So making sure we're not condemning people for doing the things that we hope that they do or wish that we could do as
Yes.
well. You know what I mean? I think that's a big one. And another one that's been a big game changer for myself and a lot of men that I've worked with is, just thinking about, and we see this happen in movies all the time where, say, a daughter brings home a boy who's just like the dad. And the dad can't understand why he hates this guy's guts before he's even opened his mouth. But at the end, we see that it's because he's just like him, right? So I often think to myself when I'm trying to think about how hard it is to shift a behavior, like, okay, Josh, if your daughter walked in the door and said, I'm marrying this boy, and this boy was just like you, what objections, like, what would happen? Would you be okay? Like, would you throw a fit? What would happen? And that I found to be a great catalyst to keep me focused. Although I'm not an advocate for us having external stimulus outside of ourselves for being reason for change, that was a tool that helped me to really lock in, though, to understand that, hey, if my daughter says, well, dad, this is the example you set for me, so naturally I'm going to think this is the perfect model of love. I want to make sure that I don't have any regrets about what I modeled for her, because she deserves far better than that. So, I found those to be especially useful when it comes to my mindset around education and modeling and what I communicate with people who are younger than me, same age as me, and older than me.
That's pretty powerful.
Thank you. So, I think that really brings us to the conclusion of our episode for today, Neetu. I've learned a lot. I've really appreciated your insight and your wisdom around this topic. I see that you put yourself in so many different settings in front of so many people to really help educate and empower them. And I think, it's definitely not easy conversations, but I thank you so much for signing up to do it, day in, day out, because you really feel the value of it. And I think that really came through for our audience today.
And the part of breaking the barrier, it's facing what's uncomfortable. So today, doing this, it did feel quite uncomfortable expressing all of these things, but also at the same time, it's also a learning process for me because I've learned so much from you and I've gained so much insight. So I really hope that this shows others that it's okay to do what's uncomfortable because it's a part of breaking those barriers.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think you modeled this tremendously. So, for our audience, before we do part for today, I would love for you to just take a moment to share with them, how they can connect with you, why they might want to connect with you, and if you want to share anything about what you have ahead for 2026, in case folks want to participate or jump in, or perhaps connect with you for your services.
Oh, so upcoming we have yoga, actually a candlelit session. And we're also going to have some talk, chit chat about mental health as well. That's going to be on Saturday, February 7th at Culture Studios. So if anyone is interested, they can reach out to me on Instagram, Netu_Lal, and we can surely make this happen.
Okay, great. And you're based in Toronto, is that correct?
Yes.
Toronto? Okay, perfect. So for our Toronto audience, I know we do have quite a Toronto audience, so definitely do check out these wonderful offerings. They are definitely done differently. And I think different is what we're all about. I think it's definitely one of our words for 2026. So, once again, thank you to our audience who tuned in for today's conversation. Please do get in our comments. Let us know what you liked, what you loved, what you learned. That's one of the ways that we can continue to build on these conversations because they're very much community conversations for all of us. Right. I hope that although this is coming through in the form of a screen, I do hope that you really feel the vibes as if we are sitting around a campfire, much like we did back in Innisfil, Canada, and just sit together and learn and grow and feel the warmth of what can emerge from that. So until next time, everyone, thank you for supporting the Umana Yana podcast and Neetu and I today for our conversation. Until then, thank you, Neetu, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
You're so welcome.